The night when Jairus' daughter was born, the midwife came late, very late. He had sent for her at the first sign that his wife was going into labor. Jairus was a respected, influential man in the community, the kind of person that people would turn to for advice or wisdom, but in this situation, he felt completely out of his depth. This was to be his and his wife's first child. And Jairus did not want to show it, but he had absolutely no idea what he was doing. And he was also terrified that he would not have a clue what to do, how to be a father, how to raise a child. And so while he waited too long for the midwife to come, while he listened to his wife's discomfort and distress, and he felt totally unable to help her, he worked himself into a frenzy. He thought of all of the worst stories he'd ever heard of childbirth, of the mothers who bled out, of the babies who came out still and blue. And he knew that this kind of thing happened too often. And he knew that he could not bear either of those possibilities. By the time the midwife had finally arrived, his wife's cries were frighteningly frequent. When he heard the clap at the door, he was ready to curse the midwife out, to call her a monster for leaving them in a lurch. But then he saw her face, and he could say nothing, for she was pale and shaking, and she looked as if she had seen a ghost. And so when she mumbled something about having had to take care of another woman, he let her pass and go in to his wife. And it was only later, once his wife had been delivered and delivered safely, thanks be to God, that the midwife told the story of what had happened. And she didn't tell Jairus. He wouldn't have understood. She only told the new mother, and she told Jairus later. That night, he hadn't cared. He'd only been relieved to know that both his wife and his child were alive and well. The child was a girl. And Jairus knew that he was supposed to feel disappointed by that, but he couldn't bring himself to be. As he held his newborn daughter in his arms, as she wrapped her tiny little fingers around his thumb, he knew that she was indeed the most precious thing in all the world to him. And he knew that there was nothing that he wouldn't do for her. The child was named after her grandmother, but Jairus would hardly use that name. In his heart, she remained ever his little girl. And so that's what he preferred to call her, Talitha, in Aramaic. Later, when things finally began to settle down in the household, when nursing and sleeping had taken on a certain rhythm and Jairus and his wife could actually find time to speak together, she told him the story that the midwife had told her. And yes, indeed, she had had a very good reason to be so late. She had received an emergency call to go to the house of a woman in town, a wealthy woman who lived in a fine home. At first, the midwife had rejoiced to receive this call because she knew this woman. She knew that she had been yearning to have a child for so long. and she thought that perhaps it had finally happened. But when she arrived at the home, she was dismayed to discover how very wrong she was. The woman's husband had always been a brute, and he had taken out his frustration on her. Whether he was angry with her failure to produce him a child or had taken some other offense wasn't clear and probably didn't matter. What mattered was that he had taken out all of his anger on her body, and she was wounded deep within. And the midwife was overwhelmed by what she saw. But she knew her duty, and she set to work. She did what she could to staunch the flow of blood, but the damage, it seemed, was far too great. By the time the midwife left for what promised to be a much more joyful duty, the woman was at least stable. The midwife felt confident that she would live, but also that she would never have a child now. She hoped that the remaining flow of blood would eventually stop, but she had seen this kind of case before, and she knew too well that it might not. "12 years passed. 12 years, during which Talitha grew and thrived, and, if it was possible, Jairus felt as if he loved her more and more each and every day. He marveled to rediscover the world through her eyes. He felt it in his body, in his own body, every time she stubbed a toe or bloodied a knee. His life was full as it had never been before. So much so that he didn't even mind when it became clear that he and his wife were fated to have no more children. Now, there were some things that troubled him during those golden years. You see, a few years after Talitha's birth, Jairus had been elected the ruler of the local synagogue. And you should not think of that in the way that you might think of it in the 21st century. When you hear the word synagogue, you should not imagine a lovely stone or wooden building where the entire community gathered to pray every Sabbath. You see, there were very, very few structures like that in Galilee in those days. No, you see, when the temple in Jerusalem still stood and provided a place for all of the people to pray, synagogues were not necessary in all the various towns and villages in Galilee and Judea. But you see, the word synagogue never actually referred to a building. It refers to the act of gathering as a community. And at that time, yes, there were gatherings in communities for various reasons, both sacred and secular. As a ruler of the synagogue, Jairus was responsible to protect the integrity of the entire community. And he had one particular difficulty in that during those 12 years. You see, it was about that woman. The woman who had held up the midwife on the night when Talitha was born. She had never truly healed from her wounds, and her flow of blood had continued uninterrupted. For 12 years, Jairus had had the joy of watching his daughter grow. She had had nothing but pain and struggle. Her affliction consumed her, It consumed her identity, so much so that people soon forgot that she even had a name and began to refer to her only by her condition. She became nothing more and nothing less than the woman with the flow of blood. Her husband took no responsibility for what he had done to her. In fact, he continually blamed her. And before long, he decided to divorce her. And he would have left her with nothing. But in this, she was more fortunate than some would have been. For she had come to the marriage with a significant dowry. And according to law and custom, she managed to hold on to a significant portion of that. But her wealth didn't do her much good. She spent almost all of it as she consulted various doctors who tried their cures on her. And let me tell you, she suffered many pains and many indignities as their hands. Why, some of them treated her even worse than her husband had. And not one of them produced the cure that he had promised. Those were her problems. Jairus struggled with a different one. As the ruler in the synagogue, he was responsible to protect the whole community. And one of the things that affected the community was blood. And the kind of flow of blood that this woman had was particularly powerful because it represented both the potential for life and for death. So the flow of blood in this woman had to be sequestered. It was so potent, it had to be set apart. And so Jairus had the duty to make sure that she did not come into contact with the assembly or indeed with anybody. And Jairus was nothing if not completely responsible. He took his duties very seriously. He zealously made sure that this woman with the flow of blood was cut off from every sort of social contract. He believed it was the right thing to do. And so for 12 years, the woman suffered a third scourge. Not only did she suffer the pain in her body, not only did she suffer the tortures of the physicians, but she was also afflicted by this man, Jairus. And the worst part was that he behaved as if what he was doing to her was nothing but a noble burden that he had to bear. "12 years passed. And Talitha, suddenly it seemed, was no longer the little girl that she had been. Puberty was approaching, and Jairus knew that it would bring changes both for her and for him. What he never anticipated was that it might not come at all. She was taken with a sudden fever and quickly grew worse. Jairus sent for the best doctors that could be found, but as we've already seen, the ministrations of doctors like them could often make things much worse. Jairus began to despair as he watched his Talitha fade. And it was just then a servant came running into Jairus' house. A fishing boat had been spotted coming in off the lake. Word was spreading through town like wildfire that the teacher, Jesus from Nazareth, who had a reputation as a great healer and wonder worker, was coming to town. When he heard that, Jairus did not hesitate, not for a moment, and he was out of the door like a shot. Jairus moved through the town's streets. Cut, 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 cut. Jairus moved through the town's streets at Jesus' side. He had used every ounce of influence and respect that he had stored up over the last 12 years to push himself to the front rank and to be the first to meet Jesus as he stepped out of his boat. But then he dissolved into tears, threw himself to the ground, and begged the teacher to come and save his dear Talitha. And he no longer cared if anyone thought him any less of him because of it. And Jesus had seen his distress and had not hesitated to come. But now people were everywhere, pressing against them on every side. Jairus begged them to let the healer through. The need was urgent. And they were making good progress, at least until Jesus suddenly stopped. "Who touched me?" he wanted to know. Jairus could not believe it. Did Jesus not understand how little time they had? They had to keep moving. Jairus impatiently said, "Teacher, how can you ask who touched me? Did you see this crowd? Who didn't touch you?" But no, Jesus was insistent. No, I felt the power go out of me. It's not the same thing." And it was at that moment that Jairus' eye caught the movement of someone out of the street and into the alleyway. And he knew that face. It was that woman with the flow of blood, the woman who had caused him nothing but trouble since the day of his daughter's birth. It was the woman from whom he had to protect his community all the time. And he suddenly understood. It must have been her who had touched the teacher. She must have been looking for the healing that had so long eluded her. Did this woman really have to spoil everything about his life? You may have heard the rest of the story. At the end of that day, 2 healings had taken place. The woman whose blood had flowed for 12 long years finally felt that flow dry up. And Jairus' 12-year-old girl was returned to her father and her mother, safe and sound. But do you recognize that there was a third healing that took place? For Jairus, the respected ruler in the synagogue, did not leave that day unchanged. Firstly, Jesus' compassion and care for a woman whom Jairus had only seen as a threat and a bother to the community made him rethink how he looked at her. For he had seen her only in terms of how she complicated his life. But a few moments and a few words from Jesus made Jairus realize that she had dealt with things that he could hardly dream of. And was not she too a child of Abraham and Sarah, and infinitely worthy of God's love and care? And he was also forced on that day to see that his daughter was not the little girl that he thought of anymore, that she was now becoming a woman in her own rights. You see, after 12 years, 2 women took their place in the community that day. One for the first time, and one restored to her place. And Jairus knew, as he had never known before, how blessed the whole community was to have both of them. And he knew he would never let the community forget it again. The story of Jairus and the woman with the flow of blood is told in a very particular way in the Gospel of Mark. Mark uses a literary device that he employs a number of times in his Gospel. Scholars have called this an intercalation. But basically it works like this. He begins one story, then interrupts it with a second story, and once that second story is completed, he goes on to finish the first. And Mark does this in his Gospel. In fact, he does it so often that we know that it's not random. He's doing it on purpose. He's trying to get his readers to understand important things by how the two stories interact with each other. So I took a good hard look at this pair of stories. And I asked myself, what is the connection that Mark wants us to make between the two stories? What's he trying to show us with that connection? And I noticed this time how the woman with the flow of blood had it the same length of time that Jairus was a father to Talitha. And I wondered, given that Jairus was a leader in this small town, what must have been a small town, what sort of contact Jairus had had with that woman over those 12 years. And my wondering led me to this story. My conclusion this time is that maybe Mark is trying to teach us something through the character of Jairus himself. Heavenly Father, let us not become so caught up in the ways that we have been taught to look at certain people who, for whatever reason, have disadvantages in this life. Let us learn to see them through the eyes of compassion, grace, and love that you have for them, and that Jesus showed so very clearly. Amen.